and welcome to another episode of The Agronomists. Now, I'm Bernard Tobin. I'm your host tonight, and you're probably saying, hey, where is Lindsay Smith? Well, Lindsay can't make it tonight. She has a case of laryngitis, and unfortunately, she's not going to be able to join us. So I have slid into the big chair, into the big seat, and I'm going to host the gathering tonight. And you may also be wondering, hey, Bern, what about the hat? What's with the hat? Well, hey, it's Halloween. And if you can't wear a hat like this on Halloween, when can you wear it? I've been wearing this one for about 20 years. So, hey, tonight's no different. So if you get a chance, put on your Halloween costume, grab some cookies, grab some snacks, maybe some chocolate bars, and maybe a beverage, and huddle up with us. We are going to talk agronomy on the Agronomists. Participation. Hey, I see a lot of folks on the chat already, and want to encourage everybody to get involved and make your comments, ask your questions. We're going to have a great chat today. So I'll be monitoring that and getting some questions into our conversation. Participation. I want to remind everybody a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. That watching this show can qualify you for continuing education credits tomorrow morning by visiting realagriculture.com/agronomists. And I want to obviously say thanks to the show's sponsors. Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, Ontario Diagnostic Days, and ADAMA Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry and fail to understand your needs, ADAMA is here to deliver, and we're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today. So tonight we have our second show looking at topics covered during the Ontario Diagnostic Days this summer. The event was live again back at Ridgetown College, University of Guelph on the campus. And they had 8 presentations, and we actually turned those into 4 episodes of Ontario Diagnostic Days on realagriculture.com. A bunch of presentations, as I said before. And tonight we're going to dig into a couple of those presentations from Diagnostic Days with 2 of our presenters from that day. We're going to talk about soybean seed quality and foliar leaf disease in corn. What we learned about these topics at Diagnostic Days this year. A look at the 2020 season as it's developed and how it relates to these topics, and some strategies for 2023. With that, I'm going to invite my guests to come on in and join me. I have today with me Horst Bohner, OMAFRA soybean specialist, and OMAFRA's plant pathologist, Albert Tenuta. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good day. Nice to be with you, Bernard. Great to see you, Albert.
Hey.
So, Bernard, how long are you going to keep that hat on before the sweat starts coming into your eyes and you start crying? That's what I want to see.
Well, I'm tough. There's nothing like a foam hat on live broadcast. We'll see. We'll see if I can last to the first video, Horst. So that we'll see how it goes. Now, Albert, is that a Halloween costume you're wearing there? I see it's a Toronto Maple Leafs hat and jersey. There's got to be something going on there.
Yeah, I'm a diehard Leaf fan, and unfortunately, a very sad and disgruntled one right now at this point because they suck right now at this point of the season and that. So I think you and I should start some wild turkey, and maybe things will smoothen out much better.
Well, and to add on that point, I will make a clear point that I have not been drinking wild turkey. I got this hat 20 years ago, and a friend of mine got it at a college football game in the U.S. Obviously, I think it probably belongs there. So I have worn it and kept it because I have never seen anything like it. And it is simply outstanding, if I must say so myself.
Well, that's why I grabbed myself a beer. I was thinking this was a party we were at. Happy Halloween, everybody.
Well, happy Halloween.
Same to you.
Hey, with that, hey, let's talk about a few. Kick things off with a look at the growing season. And Horst, I'll start with you. Specifically, how conditions have impacted soybeans. And in relation to our topics tonight. I mean, like how has the season progressed, and what have you seen from a soybean perspective?
Well, overall, I think it's a really good news story, Bernard. Here we are, end of October, and essentially all the soybeans are harvested. There's a few out there still for sure. And except for those really dry areas that just suffered terribly in July and even back in June, and the beans just never really could recover. Like I've heard some field averages, believe it or not, as low as 13 bushels, and that just hurts, right? That's just painful. But overall, the majority of the crop came off in good time, and actually yields have been okay. And I've heard some incredible averages too, as high as 82 bushels field average. Now in plots we have, and I'm curious to hear what Albert has to say. But in my plots, we've ranged from as low as 35 to 94, and seed quality has been really good. That's the point I'm getting at. This year, because of the kind of fall we've had, seed quality's actually been pretty good. Is that what you're seeing down your way, Albert?
Yeah, actually, yields have been, you know, better than average in most cases for us here. Again, it goes back to what you said, Horst, in terms of rain, right? Moisture
Mm.
made yield this year, of course, and that. And in our plots, we've ranged anywhere from, depending on our cyst nematode, heavy infestations, SDS, mid 30s, up to, we're in the 80s, pushing up to almost
Mhm.
90 in fields as well. So in our plot areas, and overall, it's been good. The quality has been good here as well. I think that's generally overall we've been seeing that as well. We're thinking maybe we would, with the heat and that, we'd see some cracking and some, it did dry down pretty quick, but it the quality looks pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. I
Um,
see. I see.
Horst,
Peter Johnson's here. I mean, who invited Peter
Oh
Johnson?
no.
I thought this was a soybean and
well,
corn talk. But
he, he,
I mean, Peter.
he's just jealous of my hat.
No, welcome, Peter. I see you made a comment here about double crop soybeans. So, as usual, my double crop trials failed once again. In my part of the world, I have a hard time. Even the 2200 heat unit beans, Peter, just are horrible. I harvested some last week. We're all done with soybean harvest, but they were green as can be, and I think they were 17 bushels. And a lot of guys had, unfortunately, a lot of hope around double crop because the fall was fairly open and they got in decent time, but then that frost shut them down, and now there isn't much for and a few cases, right? If you got them in during the very first part of July, a short season being, some guys did make it, but anyway, yeah. Overall, not that exciting on the double crop side from what I've seen.
Yeah. Hey, Horst, you got some pictures here. I want you to run through with us. A lot of green plants in the soybean fields. People have been talking about them. Talk about what's going on there and what you're seeing.
Yeah, so one of the issues that we had this year, maybe a little more than usual, and I think it's because the fall was so dry and kind of sped things up a little bit in terms of that overall even maturity. You can see on the left-hand side here, these beans have a lot of individual plants that are still quite green. On the right-hand side, they matured quite nicely. Now, sometimes it's a very simple explanation. Like you look across a field and you say, why are there parts uneven in terms of maturity? Why are these individual plants? And this happened to be a very simple explanation. This was just from a seeding depth trial. And the left-hand side, those beans were planted quite shallow, and some of them did not have enough moisture to germinate until the rain came, and they emerged a month later, and therefore you've got that uneven maturing crop just because of emergence difference. It's kind of a very simple one, but I've heard growers say that even by moving to a planter type unit, because they have more consistent depth, they're able to harvest a couple days earlier in the fall because they have a more even emergence. So anyway, very simple one. That's uh, one scenario. Let's take a look at another picture here. The next one. So these individual green plants. Now, this is where it gets a little trickier, right? And if you look at some varieties, they're worse for this. Sometimes it's worse along the field edge. And if you look at the next picture, you can really see that Um, the plant itself doesn't have a lot of pods. So, Kara, if you move to the next picture, if we can, nope, not that one. Try one more. Yeah, that one. Thank you. You can see how few pods are on there, right? And you kind of get almost that little cluster of pods at the top. So there's a couple of scenarios that causes that. The easy answer that we always go to is a virus, right? And that is true. Some viruses cause that kind of problem. But another one that comes up sometimes, especially in dry years, is mutation within those individual plants or the parents of those plants that causes a lack of pollination. And some varieties are worse than others for this. And the breeders have actually tried to get rid of some of this. When some of the first Roundup Readies came out, we had more of this than we have now. But dry conditions sometimes make this worse. Now, on the positive side, if that's the issue, if it's this mutation, there's usually a low enough number that you can ignore them and you just plow through, right, and you get the job done. But generally speaking, I think quite a few calls that I had about green beans was just the fact that it was so dry in the fall that the overall crop didn't have time to dry down evenly, right? That can happen too if things go really fast.
Yeah. Hey, I want to go to
Mhm.
Albert here in a second, but Peter Johnson's asking you for a prediction on the average yield for the province. You know, he's crowing
Unbelievable.
about his wheat crop, as you know. He's crowing about his wheat crop.
Unbelievable, that guy. So the 5 year average is 47 bushels, right? So that's the starting point. And you remember some of those yield estimates from the crop tours were in the low 50s for this year. I think the final average will be somewhere between 45 and 55.
Nothing like nothing
So,
nothing like putting a stick in the ground there, Horse. Well
no,
done, well
I'm
done.
a government guy.
Um,
That's a pretty tight number for us. That's about as accurate. This is a budgeting number. That's about as good as we get. I don't know. We'll find
hey,
out
Albert,
soon enough.
let's
That's
let's
funny.
let's talk corn. You know, what did you see from a corn perspective? Obviously, well, I'm interested in disease too. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot
Yeah.
about, you know, maybe later in the show things like tar spot. We had a lot of northern corn leaf blight this year. How does the crop shape up this year from that perspective?
Yeah. From a disease perspective, it got off on the on the slow side for us, particularly, and when it comes to the foliar diseases or diseases that were of concern or we saw this year, for sure northern corn leaf blight is the one that we've seen probably the most bounce back this year than compared to say the past 5 or even 10 years. And that so northern corn leaf blight, there we did have tar spot in certain areas. Again, not as extensive as we would have saw early on. It did go along the lake, where we had the right environmental conditions, and that for sure. And then, of course, we're starting to see, with Ben Rosser, our corn specialist, and the Dawn survey, gibberella ear rot and Dawn survey that just got released a week ago or so. We're starting to see some pockets in areas where we saw some gibberella ear rot and some Dawn as well. This year, more so than what we've seen the past couple of years. But again, overall across the province, it's a good news story when it comes to Jib and Dawn, but also in terms of overall leaf diseases as well.
Hmm. Horst, let's tackle your topic at Diagnostic Days. You and Owen Wally, we're going to see Owen in a few minutes here in a video. Really talked about as I say, soybean seed quality, and I guess let's start with, how big of an issue is seed quality? I mean, like, obviously from year to year, but are we going in the right direction?
Well, I think one of the really good things that has happened over the years is that the soybean breeders have really attempted to try and weed out some of the weaknesses for certain certain diseases that are, within the genetics of the plant. So something like phomopsis, right? We seem to have less phomopsis now than we did in the past. So that's a good news story, I think. Now, obviously, the key issue around almost all these diseases is what kind of a fall do you have, right? If it's a wet, miserable fall and you can't get those beans off, that's a real problem. And then you start to get those diseases that really start to fester and expand. And that's part of the reason why this fall seed quality has been pretty good, right? Because we could get those beans off by, in some cases, mid-October, which is just perfect, and it was fairly dry. So I think, how big of an issue is it? Well, it's a huge deal if you're growing IP beans, right? You can lose the premium, and right now for some varieties that's $5, right? It's an incredible amount of money. If you think about 60 bushels an acre, that's $300 an acre you could lose. Um, Seed quality for the subsequent crop, right? If it's kept for seed, is also a huge issue. We want clean seed for the next crop, so that's a big one. And of course, some years it doesn't happen too often, but some years we'll even get docked for crush beans, right? We've had that before too, and that can hurt as well. So it is a big deal in soybeans. There's no question. The good news is I think we're making progress. I think we're getting better as long as the weather cooperates. Now, having said that, you'll remember not this fall, but last fall when it was wet and miserable, we had some problems, right? So.
Yeah. So here's a
Yeah.
question that maybe to both of you guys, Albert, and that is like a disease like white mold. I mean, in a dry year like this year, we probably saw a lot less of that. How does being able to control that disease, trump quality at the end of the season?
Well, with any of the diseases, if you can minimize the symptoms itself, and whether it's a leaf disease or a pod disease, pathogen, and that you have that reduction or the lower the risk of it going into the seed and infecting the seed and impacting quality in that, and also reducing your risk if you do end up with a late harvest issues like Horst mentioned in terms of delayed soybeans and delayed harvest, and that resulting in infection. And that is, one of the advantages this year is we've had a good fall. We've been able to get those beans off too quickly, and that our Horst comment about phomopsis, and that is a really good example. When I started 32 years ago, phomopsis was one of our main top 3, top 4 diseases that we would see in soybeans a lot, and we would see fields in areas, particularly say in those areas that are on the heavier clay soils that generally would have a tendency to be delayed at harvest or so, having issues with phomopsis seed mold. But also at the same time, we've seen, as Horst mentioned, a great progression in terms of the breeding efforts, both public and private, to reduce our risk and build up the tolerance or resistance to phomopsis or that diaporthy complex in soybeans as well.
Awesome.
Hey,
Well,
Bernard, just because
go ahead.
you brought up white mold, I just want to make one quick comment about it. It's true that there was a lot less white mold in Eastern Ontario this year because it was fairly dry early on, right? And then, of course, the moisture did come and yields are good out there. But my only point is, keep in mind that um, inoculum in the soil, those sclerotia, right? Although they decline every year a little bit, just because there's 1 year here where we didn't have them doesn't mean we're not going to have, we're not set up for a significant white mold year in the future again, right? So white mold is one of those where if you have a history of it, you really have to plan ahead. To be honest, you plan now. You plan now for next year's season, right? With in terms of seed selection and all those good things.
Yeah, I want to get into strategy a little later on for the new year, but I
Mm.
want to go to a clip here right now from Ontario Diagnostic Days. Horst, this is you and Owen Wally from AAFC talking about a couple of the seed situations that you run into. I believe you guys covered about 10, but let's look at a couple. Go ahead.
Green seed, mature green seed, which is really an odd kind of bean seed to look at, because of course beans are supposed to be yellow, right? And what happens is if August or August and September are extremely dry, the enzyme in there will kind of dry up and the chlorophyll won't be digested. And so that chlorophyll remains in the seed, and it can be just on the inside or it can be on the outside of the seed. And of course, the problem with it is when that seed goes to the crusher, the chlorophyll gets into the oil and it makes the oil go rancid, so we get downgraded if there's a lot of green seed in the sample. So that's the first one. The other thing is, in terms of germination and vigor, we've observed and studied that both of those go down significantly, 20 and 40% respectively, if the green is throughout the whole seed. The other thing that's worth noting is that green does not go away in storage. It declines a little bit, 1 or 2%, but it doesn't go away. Okay, that's the first thing. Now let's look at the second idea here. This is one where the seed actually turns brown, and you can see that right where the hilum is, sometimes there's this brown ring, and what happens is that the pod opens up a little bit and that disease enters and infects the seed. Now, if you think about the fall as soybean plants mature and yellow, of course, from the bottom you'll often see these brown lesions, and it almost looks like brown spot, but it's not, it's alternaria. So what I'm talking about now is alternaria. And Owen, you've made the comment that alternaria is present pretty much everywhere, right?
Yeah, alternaria is going to be fairly ubiquitous. It grows saprophytically on any material that's left in the field. It can cause minor infections on the leaves, and if weather conditions and environmental conditions are correct, high enough humidity, it will enter into the pods and then start infecting the seeds. This can lead to issues with germination, but for the most part you're going to find almost over 90% of all the beans that you check will have alternaria to some degree or the other. Whether or not it's problematic is not always the case.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, right? It's the fact that a small amount, you can't even see it, no one cares. It's when we get into these wet falls that you might have enough to even make their seed brown, like we're observing right here.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Can cause some severe issues on the germination side in the spring.
Yeah, some great stuff there. Of course, a lot of other diseases you covered as well, and maybe I just say we've got some other slides. We'll probably get to those a little later. But I just want to switch over to Albert on corn. But before that, I do want to just mention our sponsors one more time. Tonight, our sponsors, ADAMA Canada, Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, and Ontario Diagnostic Days, brought to you by the partnership of the event organizing committees and OMAFRA, University of Guelph, and OSCIA. Check out all the Ontario Diagnostic Days episodes by visiting realagriculture.com, Ontario Diagnostic Days. Albert, a lot of conversation here in the chat about tar spot, and I want to get to that in a bit. Because as I say, there's a lot of talk about what happened this year and what brings next year. But let's talk about overall disease. You at Diagnostic Days really focused on genetics for northern corn leaf blight, and we saw a lot of northern corn leaf blight this year.
Yeah, no, absolutely, we did. And again, as I said, it's one that we haven't seen a lot of over the past few years or so, and it did show up, mid to late season, and you could really see the differences between those hybrids that were more susceptible and compared to others. One interesting thing is we do an annual disease survey and also for northern corn leaf blight with our colleagues at Agriculture Agri-Food Canada in Ottawa, and we see we've got about 16 different races of northern corn leaf blight in the province. Now we started to see that number start to creep up to 18, 19, possibly 20 in our research from our isolates this year. So we're starting to see a more diverse population of northern or races of northern corn leaf blight, and that will have an impact on the overall resistance levels that we see. And what we were trying to do at Diagnostic Days was show how different resistance genes, if you've got the right species or races there, you get good control. And when we talk about resistance, we're talking about two different ones. We all know about what we call this race-specific resistance, true resistance there, where you've got a single gene and the plant's has the corresponding gene to hit it and knock it down. But then we also have what we call field tolerance, and this is more durable. And my preference often is tolerance is often better than resistance. And the reason I say that is when we talk about tolerance, field tolerance, we're talking about non-specific resistance. It doesn't matter what the strains or the races are of the particular pathogen. It provides you with a baseline tolerance level. The problem with that, though, is it can go up and down depending on environmental conditions. If it's very favorable for the pathogen, you're going to see more disease. If it's unfavorable, you're going to see less disease. But again, it gives you a good basis for a management or for an integrated disease management program, whether it's corn, soybeans, and even wheat for Johnson, and that as well. But the true genetic resistance is durable. It's 100%. But the problem with that is if you get a mutation or a new race or a new type of that particular pathogen or fungus, for instance, it just bypasses that resistance and you go from 100% protection to fail. Now it's susceptible.
Northern corn leaf blight. Why the spike this year, Albert? Why? I've heard a lot of conversations about it being a bigger impact this year than a lot of people have seen in a lot of years.
Yeah, I think part of it is we just, those dry conditions early on, stressed the plants a bit. We saw some increase movement of the pathogen itself, and I think we just had a more favorable environment later on. We also started seeing tar spot coming in at that same time as we started seeing northern corn leaf blight. What I think we're starting to see is that maybe we're seeing less of those resistance genes in the hybrids that we're seeing there. We're going back to maybe some of the HT1 resistance that is the most common one there. We're maybe not seeing as much of the newer resistance genes being utilized that there was a greater focus 5-10 years ago when we saw more northern corn leaf blight than right now in that regards. And as I said, also we're starting to see new races that are able to bypass that resistance. That's just normal when we see that naturally, is that the longer we have a resistant variety or a tolerant variety out there, or a resistance gene, Mother Nature is able to take that down eventually. Some last only a year or two. We see that with the leaf rusts and that, where maybe get 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years out of it, or something like the PI 88788. We talk about soybean cyst nematode that's lasted 30 years or more.
Yeah, and to your point, Peter Johnson was asking how quickly they're breaking down, and again, they can stand the test of time, or they can go pretty quickly, right, Albert?
Yeah, and the good thing there, Peter and others, is that we've got a mix, right? So we can go into a field and we can have a percentage, a great percentage of them are those very susceptible, or those races that can take down those resistance genes, but those are still really infrequent. And we see that with these new ones, where we've got some that will take down, they'll have 1, 2, 3 M and N. Those are our 5 main genes, but they still account for very low populations, less than 1%. And so we don't see that frequency there. The good thing is we've got a mix of different resistance genes in our corn hybrids that it keeps the population off balance. And there's no one selection pressure over most of our acres across the province. There we would see a quicker shift away from that effectiveness of those resistance genes and seeing more northern corn leaf blight.
Awesome. I'm going to bring Horst back in here after our clip here, but I want to, as I say, jump to a clip from your plot at Diagnostic Days, Albert, and walking through some of the genetic options and some of the tolerances that you got. Kara, let's roll that.
If we look over here, our example is looking at northern corn leaf blight. You can see here, if we look on these leaves, very typical northern corn leaf blight symptoms. When it comes to foliar leaf diseases, 3 things to look at: size, shape, and color. We can see here our typical northern corn leaf blight, that cigar-shaped lesion, that elongated lesion, very happy fungus in this particular case. You can see that it's also an older lesion. It's starting to sporulate, so it's happy, happy, happy. The other thing to look at with these lesions too is how is it progressing. Here's a younger lesion. You can see this nice water-soaked border around it. It is the margin of progression where the disease is going. It gives you confirmation that that fungus is alive, it's working. We use our management tools such as genetic resistance, foliar fungicide to stop the fungus and stop it in its tracks. So one of the goals of the Ontario Diagnostic Days is to bring growers, agronomists, crop consultants in there and look at different approaches to managing issues. One of them is diseases, foliar diseases, and one of the best baseline management tools is genetics. And so we're going to go over there and look at how to utilize genetics to manage northern corn leaf blight. So here we've got our plots. We've got 7 different inbreds here with various different genes for resistance against northern corn leaf blight. HT genes. Hey, if we look at this one on my left here, this one has no resistance genes whatsoever. We see typical northern corn leaf blight lesions here. Those cigar-shaped, elongated, happy fungus here. It's sporulating. It's doing what northern corn leaf blight loves to do, which is infect and cause problems. On my right here, we've got the traditional HT1 gene. It's been around for a while, but we can also see that we've got quite a bit of northern corn leaf blight lesions on here. It's still effective. It has, if we go down the row, it still has less than the inbred with nothing, but it's not as effective as it used to be. Why? We're seeing more and more races. Our recent surveys are seeing anywhere from 16 races a few years ago up to 23 different races. So HT1 gene is effective, but not as effective as it used to be. So if we go down to this next series of hybrids here, you'll see this one here. Again, it's got some northern corn leaf blight. It's very typical here, but it looks different. Remember, size, shape, color. Here we're starting to see some northern corn leaf blight, and then this, what we call this chlorotic response from the HT source of resistance, and you're seeing it's trying to compartmentalize or inhibit growth of the northern corn leaf blight pathogen, and you're seeing different symptoms here. So it's working better than the HT1 gene, but we still have some lesions here that are typical. That means those races that are here are able to bypass that resistance. Here on this one that has HT3 gene, we're also seeing similar. We're seeing less than we saw earlier on with the HT1 and without, but again, we still have some, not to the same degree, so it's working much more effectively. Why are we seeing disease even on these genes? Because we're looking at what we call a race-specific resistance. Either has the gene and it corresponds to that race of the pathogen. If they have the 2, it's absolute, you won't get infection. But what happens when you have multiple different races, it's able to jump over that resistance and hence get disease.
Some great work there, Albert. Some good work by from the fella behind the camera, I might add. I think that was me.
Yes.
Hey, just want to one more shout out to our sponsors for the day. Tonight, again, ADAMA Canada, Ontario Diagnostic Days, and Decisive Farming. Your soil has a unique story. At Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, we get that. Let's optimize your fertilizer costs and replenish your soil by tailoring nutrient plans to meet your field's needs. Visit decisivefarmings.com to learn about how to get soil health insights today. Albert, I just want to build on what you did here. What we didn't see in that video was, the other half of the story, and that is fungicides. And I want to let's talk about obviously the genetic story, but that 1-2 punch and where fungicides fit here as well.
Yeah, so the genetic influence there, the reason they work is they're reducing symptoms. You're reducing reproduction, so you're reducing the inoculum load within that season and potentially decreasing your risk within the season and that follow up next year and that. And so we talk about an integrated disease management program. We start with a tolerant hybrid or resistant variety or hybrid in this particular case, and then we go from there. And fungicides have become a critical piece of management, as we see with tar spot, even with northern corn leaf blight and others. But particularly, we're starting to see an increase in fungicide use and efficacy when it comes to many of our foliar corn leaf diseases. And rust and tar spot has really brought that to the forefront over the past few years, because there's a good example of where we don't have that backup. We don't have that tolerance. We don't have that resistance that we do have with northern corn leaf blight and many of our other diseases out there. And I believe Warren mentioned, even common rust in corn. There again is a good example of a pathogen that can reproduce quickly, produce a whole bunch of different races and that can bypass resistance quickly as well. But again, even there, we've got a good background levels of tolerance and resistance from that hybrid as well. Yeah. And so we've got great fungicides available. It's important though to remember that all the fungicides have strengths, and they also may not cover or get the same level of control with other diseases as well. And so keep that in mind. And also it's important on the timing side as well. And we can talk about that later.
Yep. Couple things.
Hey, Albert, I have a quick question on tar spot. Sorry to interrupt there, Bernard, but is it possible, Albert, that in our geography that we won't see that much tar spot just because it might come in later in the season? Some of these diseases, they don't, because of where we are, they're not as big of a deal. I've wondered that when it comes to tar spot. What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm thinking with tar spot, it's one that we're going to have that's going to start to establish it. We're starting to see it establish in Michigan. We're starting to see it in Wisconsin and those areas, and they're about 5 years ahead of where we are. But you're right, Horst. In many cases, we start seeing some diseases. We see that with insect pests too, and that we start seeing them for a year or two, and then Mother Nature comes in, and we see less of that over time. With tar spot, I normally would say that my concern would be a lower than it is right now because of what happened last year. Last year, we shouldn't have had as much tar spot as we had across as big an area in the province. Because if you think about what happened in 2020, as Peter and others commented here, seeing tar spot come in mid to late September didn't have a big impact in 2020. We may have seen maybe a 5 bushel, 10 bushel in some of those hot spot areas and in some fields in that, but overall not a lot. We saw a lot of tar spot on the upper leaves, and that going into last year, into 2021, we didn't have a lot of inoculum built in the area, and all of that came from the U.S. That all blew up early. We started seeing tar spot, and it just, with the right environmental conditions, we saw what we saw in 2021. The interesting part is that we've got plots out not too far from my house right here. Within 1 day difference between 2021 and 22 is when we first saw tar spot in those fields. The big difference was last year it was really favorable for tar spot development. This year was hot and dry for 5 weeks, didn't cut my lawn for 5 weeks or so. That delayed things. And also we didn't get that inoculum load in from the US. So that movement in, we see that with rust, we see those with other diseases. We can't control that. But the other issue here is those regional. Think of tar spot as a regional disease. Think of it as Fusarium head blight, Gibberella ear rot, white mold even, and those where you've got those hot pockets, areas of the province where the disease is going to be there. You mentioned that earlier. The weather will drive it, whether we see it or not, and that. So pay attention to your fields, but also the region and what's going on in there.
Albert, I want to come back to terra spot in a second, but I want to close off soybeans and seed quality with Horst. And we talked about 2023 strategies, Horst. How should growers be, thinking about seed choices, to help manage quality issues? The issues you talked about, and many more that you didn't get a chance to touch on.
Yeah, so I think one clear starting point is always to grow clean seed, right? And if you look at the picture at the bottom there on your screen, that's soybean mosaic virus, and that's a good example of one that's transferred on the seed, right? And there are others. If you go to the next page, we've already talked about some of the ones further up, but if we flip to the next page, there's ones like bean pod mottle virus, right? That's transmitted by insects. But then if you look at purple seed stain, right, that's another one that if you have seed lots that have that purple seed stain, that's going to be an issue in the future. And of course, not every seed that is infected actually has that purpling. So the point of the story is if you see these kind of odd things or this hilum bleeding, it's really important to try and figure it out, especially if that seed is going to be kept. Now, of course, if you're buying certified seed, you're trusting that your supplier is looking after you, because of course you can't tell because of some of the colors of the seed treatments have nicely coated those, and we want that fungicide on there. Of course, that is a positive thing in terms of the subsequent crop as well, and the fungicide seed treatment really helps. So starting with clean seed, and then of course a fungicide seed treatment. And this is the other really learning again from this year in my trials. A foliar fungicide on soybeans, boy, if I was growing seed beans, I would put that in my budget, because it really does make a difference in terms of quality, size, and yield, right? This year, we had some pretty terrific results again with some of our foliar fungicides, even though it wasn't a real wet year for my area, right? So that's another one. And the other one that's, this is old news. This is, agronomy 101, but I learned this like anything this year at one location up at Elora. There we had some soybeans on ground following alfalfa, right? And it had been in alfalfa for quite a few years. Went about 75 bushels, right? Where it was a corn bean rotation, it was about 60 bushels. And where it was a bean, it was about 45 bushels. Like, because it was such an extreme year up there, oh my goodness, crop rotation is so huge for soybeans because they have such wimpy roots, right? And so you start to bring all these things together. But enough on that. That's where my head is at today.
What about Johnson's thoughts on seed treatment control here and the impact that can make, Horst?
Yeah, so I mean, as a general practice, I think we have in Ontario rightfully moved to saying that all soybeans should get at least a fungicide seed treatment. As an industry, when I started 20 years ago, that wasn't really the norm, but we've kind of learned over the years that there is enough of a benefit both in yield and especially in plant stands if it's a wet, cool kind of spring and with early planting dates. I'm a big fan of the fungicide seed treatments. I personally don't plant anything that doesn't have a fungicide seed treatment on it. That's where my head is at. And it's not that it's always huge, right? Sometimes it's zero. That's the way it is. But on average, there's enough there to make it worthwhile. And again, with some of these diseases, yes, it helps. Not all of them, but some of them, it does help.
Yeah. Albert, let's dig into tar spot here. Lots of Sorry, unless you want to add anything there.
Well, the only comment there is make sure that, when we talk about seed treatments, we're targeting two different type of seedling diseases, right, Horst, in terms of what we call the water molds versus more of our regular fungal pathogens, our fusariums, our rhizoctonias, and those as well. So remember that when you're looking at a seed treatment, you're looking for those products that have, that metal axle M in there to help you with the oomycetes or those water molds, those pythiums and the phytophthora, and then the other seed treatment, the fungicide active ingredients that can help us with the, with the rhizox, the fusarium, the general fungal pathogens that we see there as well.
Right.
Yeah, and I think what Peter was getting at there a little bit is that we shouldn't expect complete control, because if it's a virus or if it's something like downy mildew, these fungicides aren't going to work, right? I mean, that's not what they do. Just to be clear,
No.
right? I mean, we don't want to oversell this stuff.
Right.
Well, and some have a bit more tolerance, say, or better control, say, for phomopsis, and others as well. There's so many things that go on in that seed, particularly within the first 2 or 3 weeks, that can play a big role, right? In terms of do they emerge, don't they, and that as well. So on tar spot, Bern.
Yeah.
What would you?
I'm
Yep.
just going through the chat here. Lots of farmer schnecks in here, and a lot of people talking about. I guess the first thing that comes up to my mind here is when tar spot arrives, Albert. I mean, whether
Yeah.
it's coming in September or in July, August. How big, how much impact is that timing? I mean, if we get past a certain time, are we in the clear?
Yeah, so this year, definitely, last year with our fungicide trials, a very effective fungicide versus our check, we were seeing 35, 40 or more bushels with that. This year, our best one so far to date has been around 30 bushels. So even there, I was surprised that we saw that much. Talking to my grower cooperator here, a good friend of mine, he had 20 different hybrids, and they ranged anywhere from, I believe, like 5-7 bushels up to 50 bushels difference with a fungicide application. Again, a lot of that disease came in, say, mid to late August, much different than last year. By the time we got into that first week of September, we had hybrids that were already senescing last year. Whereas this year, that was like a month behind. But still, again, had enough of an impact on yield. So it is a disease that, as you can tell with the chat and just the conversations out there, the concern in terms of the industry and the growers, it's definitely of concern. But one of the most important learnings that we had over the past couple of years is that we do have tools available to us. We do have the fungicides. We do have some tolerance in hybrids, and that we have the ability to get those fungicides on where it needs to be and get good control. And we have the ability to scout and that. So although tar spot is a disease that is of concern, we have management tools. It's just a matter of improving on those and getting them. The big question this year was the timing side, right? Did you last year, that VTR1? Unfortunately, I didn't have a room, or I didn't expect to have as much tar spot as we did, so we concentrated on that VTR1. And if you don't get anything out of this, that VTR1, because of other diseases, and particularly around gibberella, ear rot, dawn, mycotoxins, and that, is still been the one that we need to still concentrate, the one that's been most consistent year to year, regardless of where you're at in the Great Lakes. And that is one that we still have to consider, and one that I would have a hard time recommending to anybody to go away from and not having at least that VTR1 fungicide application. Anything that we had this year, those early V7s to V10s, we saw no impact. It was way too early. The disease came too late for those. We did see that V10, V12 application provide us with good control, better than we had thought. The VTR1s as well provided us one. We had late applications 3 to 4 weeks after our VT apps that did very well. but not that much better than what we saw with our traditional tassel silking application to pay for that difference, say, of having a second application or so as well. And so this is early. We just pulled off those on Friday, and unfortunately Saturday our water pump blew on Dave Hooker's winter stagger that we borrowed, because ours is in the shop too. So I owe Dave and that as well. So we still got some plots to take off, but we'll have a lot of good data on the different application timings, 1 versus 2 apps, and all that. We definitely can get 2 apps work very well. Will it pay for itself is the question.
Now, Albert, you've seen 2 totally different years in the last 2 years, right? You had those perfect conditions and a lot different this year. What have you learned from those 2 different years? Obviously, you talked about a lot of your trials, but when June and July roll around next year, what bells and alarms and whistles are going to be going off for you?
Well, I think based on what we've seen and what we've seen in our colleagues in the U.S. is that first week of July we're probably going to find tar spot in the province, and what the key will be is what those weather conditions will be after. What we had last year and what we had this year are probably the 2 bookends, Bern. We're going to be somewhere in the middle in there. There's a good government response there, right, Horst? And that as well. And I think we have probably the 2 extremes. And so we'll be in there. What we're going to end up seeing is areas along the lake that we saw this year. So from Essex through to Niagara will probably be higher risk than areas as you start moving into London, north of London, and potentially into central and then eastern Ontario as well. Having said that, we saw that inoculum load coming in from, say, Michigan can get into Huron, Bruce, Grey, Perth, and those counties as well. So again, getting those early. The earlier the disease starts, the greater potential we have on the impact for it.
We got lots of stuff going on in the chat. I'm going to bring Horst back in here. We've got a question from Jason Voigt. What impact are we seeing on soybean yield from other foliar diseases like bacterial blights, downy mildew, or frog eye leaf spot?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think it really depends on the severity of the disease or the bacteria or the pest in a specific field, right? So bacterial blights, generally they look a little ugly, but they don't do much, right? I mean, I think even there was some work at Ohio State that showed 5 bushels in kind of a worst case scenario, but that's not the number I want you to remember. I mean, that's kind of an absolute worst case scenario. I don't think they're a big deal. Downy mildew for sure is a quality problem and can reduce yield. And frog eye leaf spot, again, yeah, it depends on the amount. In my part of the world, I wouldn't even know where to take you to find frog eye leaf spot, to be honest with you. But where Albert is, maybe there's a little more. And so there's no quick. I really am going to play the government card here and say it depends, because it really does on these diseases. Same with sudden death. To be honest with you, a little bit of sudden death is not the end of the world at all. But if you have Albert, we've both seen fields that have been completely devastated by sudden death. So it all depends on the amount in the specific field.
Yeah, and so with all of those, like the bacterial blights, as Horst said, we see minimal impact overall on yields. Having said that, there are some that are incredibly susceptible. If you have the right environmental conditions, of course, you'll see more. Those will be more hotspots, right? You'll have little pockets here and there as opposed to the entire field, unless you've got a severe seed issue or infection issue. Downy mildew, the same thing there. The frog eye leaf spot, that's one that we do not see a lot of or haven't. We've got some high varieties that are more susceptible. I used to see more 5 or 10 years ago than we are seeing right now for us. So there are, again, a good job in terms of the breeding efforts there. But one thing to be careful about with frog eye leaf spot or Cercospora sogina in the US, we've seen that is the one where we got our fungicide resistant issues. Started with some of the strobies, and now we're starting to see it with some of the other fungicide classes, and that is a big concern, right? With that one, you're looking at 90 50% or more of the frog eye in certain states and certain fields, certain areas that are resistant to some of our strobies and some of those fungicides as well. So something to keep in mind. And that's another thing. As you're evaluating, regardless of whether it's corn, soybeans, wheat, dry beans, whatever, if you see a disease, you either have a resistant variety that should be performing well, or you have a fungicide application that should be controlling that disease, and you don't see that level of control, something's going on. Is it an issue in terms of, product issue, timing, whatever? Maybe it's a bacterial identification versus a fungal pathogen, or is it a resistant issue? So if something doesn't look right, dig into it a bit more to find out what's going on, or call Horst and he'll answer it.
Well, the other thing that comes
Albert,
to mind on that, the one other thing I just make a comment about is, we've got some awesome soybean prices. I expect we're going to have a huge crop next year of soybeans, and some of that will be double or the third year or even fourth year soybeans, or some of the people that I know that have been growing soybeans for 10 years in a row. The point of the story is typically it's second year soybeans that really hit you. Even stuff like soybean cyst nematode, right? If it's
Yeah.
after corn, okay, maybe you see 5 or 10% yield loss, but then you grow beans again, and we've seen scenarios where then all of a sudden it's 30% yield loss or more. It's that second year soybeans, so you really got to be careful in those fields to know what the disease and pest spectrum has been in the past.
yeah.
Mhm.
And you just let's take that over to corn, Albert. Corn on corn with tar spot. Some discussion here in the chat as well. Is that something we need to be very mindful?
Yeah. So again, it goes in that infield risk. Sure, that might be a situation. Our tar spot location that we have utilized, that today, I think it was the third or fourth year corn, depending on where we're at in there. So of course that potentially a risk, but based on the data that we've seen out of the U.S. and that is a marginal risk there. The same thing, crop rotation doesn't have a big influence because again, these are airborne pathogens, and tillage doesn't seem to impact it as much as we would have thought too. So, as Peter Johnson likes to say, if you bring out the plow, you should get rid of all the diseases and all that good stuff, right? And that, but in this particular case, we're not seeing that same level of control that we would see. So again, it goes back to that region, right? These are all airborne pathogens, and they're almost impossible to eliminate or keep out of your field as if they're established in a region. And so residue is an important piece. But again, whether we're looking at 2 years of that residue surviving there or beyond, we will still have that risk there. We could eliminate all our residue and we can still get a big blow in of spores like we had last year from the US and that.
Yeah. Hey, final couple questions here. I'm going to wrap it up. There was a question about the Tar Spotter app, Albert. I know you guys, it's a great tool. Yeah, you had a bump in the road this summer. What happened there? What do you think? How does that go forward next year?
Yeah, so on that Tar Spotter app, it's worked really well for us over the past, up to this year. In many cases, there was some provider changes, I believe, in terms of the weather provider and that. So there might have been some issues around there. It definitely early on it was red and high risk. Now remember, it's looking at the environmental conditions and not whether or not the pathogen is there. The other thing to keep in mind that the tar spotter doesn't kick in until you're into that V8, V10 leaf stage as well. So anything before that, I basically ignore. And that we've got definitely needs some tuning, and Damon Smith, University of Wisconsin, is looking into that. But again, that's the important part of the validation, and thank you all for who's helped us in terms of providing weather data as well as disease data, so that we can validate and make these things better as well. But it's only one part of the tool. one tool in the toolbox, Bern.
Yeah. Albert, this wraps up. I guess this is our second Ontario Diagnostic Days feature episode on the agronomists. Just some final thoughts on it. Back in the field this year, 8 presentations. A lot of people wandering around Ridgetown asking questions and listening. Take us back there and how that went this year.
Yeah, I think it was a big success. Again, we cut back on terms of the numbers of people. Normally, we'll have 200 per day. This year, we kept it in half to manage it, as well as provide you with the opportunity to interview our speakers too, so that we could do the videos and that as well. As we found with the Ontario Ag Conference and delivering a virtual conference there, and over the past couple of years with Diagnostic Days, it takes a lot of work to do the videos and getting those. And Bern and the Real Ag team, we appreciate your help and that, and your patience and tolerance with me especially, and that to help us with getting those videos over. You mentioned our sponsors and that, we could not have delivered Diagnostic Days, the Ontario Ag Conference, if it wasn't for the sponsors that basically went on faith on our back, what we've done in the past, for whether it was SWAC or Old Farm Smart or Eastern Ontario Conference, and coming out with the Ontario Ag Conference, or going virtual with Diagnostic Days. So we have to thank all of our sponsors and that. And then, of course, everybody that registered and participated, all of you on tonight, and others that stuck with us through those 2 years, because we didn't know what we were going to do. And in many cases, it was we were going blind, and it worked really well. And we appreciate all of that. And now we're kind of in a stuck position here, because everybody wants everything now. So they want virtual as recordings and to be in person in that. And we'll see how that goes. And so there's our plug for the Ontario Ag Conference, January 4th and 5th, where we're going to be live at Ridgetown, live at Waterloo, and live at Kempville. And tomorrow should be in the mail with the Ontario Farmer, our brochure, and registration is going to open tomorrow as well. And again, we're going to try to deliver both a virtual and in-person experience with the same quality that we've always been able to do. And we have to thank everybody there and all our volunteers. Even that bugger, Peter Johnson, who's a pain in the butt sometimes, has put a lot of work into it, as well as many others.
Awesome. Well, hey, always great. As I say, I've been really enjoyed working with both of you on Diagnostic Days, behind the camera, in front of the camera, and getting the product together and getting it up on Real Agriculture. So always great to work with you both. And thank you both for coming on to the Agronomists tonight and joining us. And with that, I'll wrap up the show with one more shout out to our sponsors. Thanks again to ADAMA Canada, Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, and the Ontario Diagnostic Days for being the show's sponsors today. With that, I will bid adieu, and thanks everybody for putting up with the wild turkey. And I guess